Good evening to the students of Edwardsville High School and the AP US History classes of Mr. Baker. I am using black and white today because we're talking about the 1950s, before color was invented. And as we prepare for today's lesson, I would encourage you to go to edmodo.com to the Honors American History folder, which is the only one you have access to, and find a folder called Cold War. In the Cold War folder, you'll find Lesson 22, III 2, Chapter 26, Section 3, Part 2. So you're going to the Cold War folder 26.3.2. And as we prepare for today's lesson on the Cold War, I would like to, as you get those notes ready, you can open them in a separate window while you watch this. But the reminder is for the 5 things. We never actually took the 5 things quiz, but let's remember that there are 5 things that characterize the Cold War. I'm actually going to add a 6th thing to our 5 things list by the end of this lesson. But number 1 is Winston Churchill said that an Iron Curtain was descending over Eastern Europe. He described both an ideological and physical difference that was being created. A physical barrier was being built between East Germany and West Germany and across all of Europe. He said this in Fulton, Missouri at Westminster College. The second part is that George Kennan, in what is known as the Long Telegram, described a process of long-term patient containment. He said that America was not going to simply defeat communism. This wasn't the kind of enemy that you can drive tanks into and just shoot and you can win. This is an idea, and you can't defeat ideas with the military. He said that you can contain it, though, and let it demonstrate its inferiority. He said that communism as an economic system is inferior, and it will eventually demonstrate that by itself without us having to actually end communism forcibly. George Kennan is number 2. Number 3 on the list is Dean Acheson, who said there are only 2 great superpowers remaining in the world. And of course, those great superpowers are Russia, who won the war in Europe, and America, who won the war in the Pacific. And now, of course, if your parents are watching, they're like, but I thought America won the war in Europe. Well, I'll let you take care of that. Number 4 on the list is President Harry S. Truman, who described the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is a belief that America should help all nation states that seek to resist the advance of communism. And number 5 is the Marshall Plan. George Marshall said that the United States should economically rebuild Europe rather than repeat the errors of the Treaty of Versailles. By doing so, we can create markets into which our finished goods will be sold. And that sounds a lot like mercantilism. You should tell the people around you. Right now, you should find someone and tell them what mercantilism is. I'll tell my wife, who's sitting at the other side of the table, hey, honey.
Hey, sweetheart.
Do you know what mercantilism is?
Why do you do this to me all the time?
It's a
balanced trade.
It's a belief. Yeah. Words. You're using words.
Balanced trade. Yes.
It's a belief.
Belief
that a positive balance of trade makes a nation strong. Yes, I have the best wife. So
ever.
Those 5 things characterize the Cold War. Let's get to it. So today we are starting on slide 16 of 36. And I'll remind you that the Cold War was caused by not only the ideological difference between communists and the United States, but by also Dean Acheson speaking to the National Press Club in January of 1950, and he did not include South Korea in what was described as our sphere of influence. And the Russians took that as a pretty direct message that we no longer cared about South Korea. Of course, that's not true. And we didn't have the best diplomacy with Russia. We didn't have the ability to pick up a phone and call them. You'd think that the 2 nuclear powers on the earth would be willing to talk to each other, but we weren't going to talk to them directly because they're communists. There were multiple steps of intermediary diplomacy before a message could directly be delivered. There was a teletype later instituted, later created, but that took a long time to develop. So in 1950, Dean Acheson didn't include South Korea in what he described as our sphere of influence, and by July, The Russians had equipped the North Koreans, and they were invading across the 39th parallel. At the end of the war in 1953, the United States had achieved a ceasefire with North Korea. And that's not the same as winning. It's not a treaty. And so technically, there's still some unresolved tension between the United States and North Korea, as you may be aware. The United States public had a legitimate question that they asked at this time. Was the U.S. government serious about stopping communism? Because we had not lost a war before, and we now were in a position to where something that is antithetical to our economic and political systems was allowed to remain in a place we tried to oppose it. And so the question is somewhat legitimate for U.S. people. The next slide shows the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. No matter where you stand, one of these individuals is looking at you. And we had created a decades-long enemy in China. The recognition of Taiwan, of course, was step one. We did not see Taiwan as simply a renegade province as China sees it. This is today known as the Two-China policy. But the United Nations Security Council seat was given to Taiwan rather than to big communist China. And it took decades to resolve that. We, of course, have a historical opposition to communism. We sent some troops to participate in the civil war in Russia after World War I, and we tried to restore the Tsar rather than see a communist government grow. We approached the Yalu River when the Chinese warned us against it, and they will not forget that quickly. And of course, fighting the Korean War was the primary development of this long-term communist American oppositional system. You'll see a couple memes and cartoons in the next couple slides, and one of the points that we're going to talk about with those is that the movie that you're going to watch, hopefully tonight or tomorrow, is called The Atomic Cafe. And some of these images, some of these ideas that are seen in those cartoons and videos are characteristic of the nuclear hysteria that's developed in the 1950s after the Korean War. The United States, of course, has an awful lot of psychological trauma about nuclear weapons, as does the rest of the world, legitimately. Weapons of this scale and scope had never been seen in human history before. So now that you have a weapon that can kill 70,000 immediately and 70,000 by residual radiation, the nature of war has changed. In 1949, America develops the hydrogen bomb, which is 35 to 50 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And in 1950, the Soviet Union develops the hydrogen bomb. And so now there's two enemies that control the world, who hate each other, and have world-destroying capabilities. That's going to cause some nuclear hysteria. That's what we're going to call this. And if you would, tonight, find a movie called The Atomic Cafe. You can find it at snagfilms.com, snagfilms.com. If you Google Snag Films The Atomic Cafe, you will find it. I hope you enjoy it. I know that every time I watch it, I'm shocked at what we were like. You'll find a lot of the imagery and ideas contained in the Fallout games. In fact, the soundtrack to the Fallout games has some of the songs that you're going to hear in this movie. It's a collection of Army training videos. It's a collection of news reports, of advertisements. It's a lot of things that describe our obsessive awareness, our obsessive hysteria about the fact that we are going to be killed at any given moment in a nuclear holocaust. I hope you watch it with somebody else. Find someone else to watch this with. All right, let's move on with slide number 23. Slide 23 describes that American citizens are, of course, concerned that now that the world is divided between two superpowers, and all of communist China and all of communist Soviet Union are aligned against the United States, that our neighbors might be spies. They might be communist spies. There was a rumor a long time ago that one of the professors at SIU Edwardsville who lived in Edwardsville, was a communist spy. I don't know what became of that, but I know people who claim it to be true, but I don't have evidence for it. On slide number 24, we see Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator from Wisconsin who became popular and famous during the 1950s because of his predisposition for hating communists and for engaging in communist hunting. In Virginia, he once gave a speech in which he held up a piece of paper and claimed to know the identities of 205 communists in the United States State Department. Well, obviously, people are going to ask, what are the names of these 205 communists in the State Department? How did they get into the State Department, and why are we not prosecuting them right now? So when pressed for the names, he reduced the number to 57. In reality, these names probably were not communists, because these are the only people tried under the loyalty program instituted by Harry Truman, and they were not found guilty of communism. There was no evidence of it. So was he ruining people's lives simply to promote his own career? I know you're shocked, but yes. On slide 26, we see a book called How Stalin Hopes We Will Destroy America. And of course, the idea here is that if we are not vigilant, if we do not aggressively pursue communists, then communists will worm their way slowly into every aspect of American life. On the next slide, you can see that George McCarthy suggests the same. George McCarthy suggests that the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who established the Marshall Plan, was in a, and I quote, conspiracy so immense as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man, end quote. That's probably not true, and there's no evidence of it, because George Marshall was engaged in creating markets into which we could sell finished goods. And that sounds a whole lot like mercantilism, not like communism. So, no, not true. McCarthy was simply trying to promote his own political career. The political cartoon that follows is from the Clinton era, and it is, you should be aware of the context of both events, of both the Clinton events, which we will talk about later, and the McCarthy events from the 1950s. This cartoon is, of course, fair game, and you need to be aware of the context. On the next slide, there's a book that I actually own called Communist Socialist Propaganda in American Schools. Teachers, lawyers, and the educated were suspecting of being communists, especially in public education. And that's because there are certain words, certain ideas that are hard to easily identify. And one of those words is socialist. One of those words is communist. One of those words is fascist. These words have a meaning. And fascist does not simply mean bully who makes rules I don't like. Communist doesn't just mean someone who's in a group that I'm opposed to. Communist and fascist means something specific. Let me remind you, though, that fascist means to subordinate a system that subordinates the identity of the individual to the state. Communist means that the workers own the means of production. And socialist means a spectrum of things. Of course, the word socialism is misused by everyone who seeks a certain perspective. And if your family members are listening right now, this is the time where they may say, that doesn't sound like what I know. Well, for the AP US History curriculum, this is what we know. We know that socialism exists on a spectrum from, first of all, Hamiltonian socialism. Hamiltonian socialism is the idea that we're going to tax and we're going to create tariffs, like in Hamilton's idea of funding and assumption. And we're going to spend that money on the military. We're going to spend that money to build roads, which was Henry Clay's American system. We're going to spend that money to fund the fire departments, the police departments. And that's not very weird, is it? I mean, the military, police, fire, and infrastructure is all pretty normal for us. So we are ostensibly Hamiltonian socialists in America today. So the word socialism isn't that strange. Now, the second version of socialism is the kind practiced in Western Europe. It's democratic socialism. And they have higher taxes, but they have free health care, and education is largely free. So in the world today, we're one of the few developed Western states that does not practice democratic socialism. It's not that strange. In fact, we're in the minority for not practicing it. And the third kind you'll find in South America. That is national socialism, in which the government seizes the utilities, and that never works out very well. If someone wants to insult socialism, that's normally what they'll say it means, although it means a lot of different things. Okay, that's why I and other educated people get suspected, because we have a greater granularity in our definitions of certain words. So, McCarthy even implied that the United States Army... Would you like to bring him over here for a minute? Stand back here. So in each video, I would like to introduce you to the cat that shows up. This is my daughter holding Schmitty Werben Jensen. Schmitty's a good boy. We call him Binky. He's good to people. He's not great with other cats, and we have 4. All right, so thank you, Schmitty, and honor. So on the next slide, slide number 30, McCarthy even implied that the United States Army was full of communists. The United States Army, understandably, did not take that very well, and they said that these wild allegations have to stop. I want to warn you, first of all, I've watched this movie, I Married a Communist. It's not very good.
I'm not a communist.
No, there's a movie that's on this slide that says, I Married a Communist. I've seen the movie, and I learned my lesson, and I did not marry a communist.
Good for you.
Yes, good for me. It's not, just skip it. It's not good. You should watch The Atomic Cafe instead. In 1954, the Army McCarthy hearings occurred, and the Army and Tail Gunner Joe, I'm using his nickname so you know what it is, agreed that the events in this debate should be televised. So on public television were the Army McCarthy hearings, and when the American public heard the line of questioning that McCarthy was engaged in, it became clear that he didn't have any evidence. He was simply seeking a sensationalism that was going to get him reelected. And the American public didn't want a con man in office, and so the American public opinion turned against him. Good for you, America. Unfortunately, there have been other times in U.S. history where scapegoats were created for the advancement of an agenda. We know that the Know-Nothings from the antebellum period were like this. The anti-Masons were like that. There have been anti-Catholic movements in U.S. history. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible from the Puritan era that describes this process very well. In fact, he wrote it to describe McCarthyism directly. So on slide 33, the rhetorical question is asked, what had America lost or gained by going through this process? Well, we'd lost trust, honestly. Americans did not trust each other. There was this fear that your neighbor could be a communist, and if your neighbor believed that you did not have a valid claim to your personal property, then you didn't like your neighbor. And how can you tell if someone's a communist? Someone's inner beliefs are not seen in an outer way. Do we then create sort of a public conversion experience in which we demonstrate our non-communist beliefs? There are a lot of things that are developed in American society in the 1950s and 60s where Americans show each other that they're not communist. Conspicuous consumption becomes one of the ways we can show each other that we're not communists. On the next slide, number 34, it says, Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953 and was able to achieve a ceasefire in the Korean War because Stalin had died that year. So both the United States and the Soviet Union had hydrogen bombs, and it was a very dangerous time. I want to give Eisenhower credit, quick shout out to Eisenhower, for getting rid of segregation in the military. He ended what Truman had started, and he said, I don't care what color someone's skin is, I need them to fight. And Eisenhower had a question for the world. He said that in only 84 years, and you'll see this on the Atomic Cafe, Eisenhower said in only 84 years, America had gone from the musket to nuclear weapons. And he asked, can any society actually manage that transition? We see that in Japan, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry takes an arguably 1400s, a 15th century society, and within 60 years they are transformed into a modern military with modern weapons. And Mizuki Shigeru's manga that we read describes the process through which a society like that is given technology at a rapid advancement, more rapid than their society can manage. And Eisenhower asked that of us. Can we manage the 84-year transition from the musket to the nuclear weapon as a world in a way that's safe? And I'm glad we're still here. I don't know that we were 100% successful, but we didn't end the world. Oh, by the way, you should show your family that video of all nuclear detonations. If you just Google all nuclear detonations in the world, that's 14 minutes of family fun right there. I don't know what your family does for fun, but I think that's going to be good. So on slide number 35 is number 6 on our list of 5 things. Yes, our list of 5 things now has 6 things. Eisenhower believed in the domino theory concerning communism in Asia. It was believed that if one nation fell to communism, then the next one contiguous to it geographically would also fall to communism, and they would fall like dominoes. I joke on the slide, Domino's is probably one of your better options for a meal tonight if you don't want to cook, since they will bring it to you. So the theory says, the Domino's theory says, that if one country falls to communism, others will soon follow until the entire world is communist. And this isn't just rhetoric. I mean, North Korea really did attack South across the 39th parallel, seeking to turn their neighbors into communists. And so there's not just an existential dread about it, but we see an active role by the communist nation states seeking to do just that. And Stalin, of course, predicted that it would happen. So we have come to the end of today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to try to make it more interesting in the future. But let's remember, tonight or tomorrow, please find the Atomic Cafe at snagfilms.com and watch it. It's only 88 minutes, like 75 minutes without the end credits, and I think you're going to like it. My question is, I've got one question for you as you watch the Atomic Cafe. Who is the worst dad in Atomic Cafe? Because I can tell you right now, that dad is way worse than any dad you know. There's a really bad dad in it, and I want to know who it is. Okay, stay safe, don't touch anybody or anything, and I will see you in a video tomorrow.